You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 349 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. Will is, of course, a staff writer at RT. Me and him have written articles together. One appeared at Consortium News. He also has bylines at antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute, where you find this show and my daily news roundup. So great place to find my and Will's work is at the Libertarian Institute. And then most of what Will posts actually ends up on his Twitter feed as well, even though not always in the byline of the article. So check out at WKP and CAP. Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back on. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we got 50 episodes together coming up, so maybe we'll do a little bit of a different or a fun episode for that. But for today, we're talking about Iran, the explosions of some tankers at a UAE port, and then the chemical weapons attack in Douma, which I think we keep saying we've done like the final analysis on that, but more evidence continues to come up. So, you know, we're going to continue to try to bring what we think is the most factual story to you guys. So let's start off here with Iran, Will, which, I mean, probably biggest issue, what my audience is most interested in and most concerned about is what's going to happen with Iran. Is the U.S. going to war? And I know you've been covering some of these recent developments at RT, including what actually is being deployed to the Middle East here. And, you know, it was made to be a big deal by John Bolton's statement on it. And I guess kind of just start off here with a breakdown of what's going on recently in U.S.-Iranian relations and then get into what's being deployed.
Sure. So, yeah, as you've yourself covered on this show so well, the Trump administration has been, feuding quite a lot with the government in Tehran. Since Trump took power, really, it's sort of been the entire time. So you've had, Donald Trump's abrogation of the nuclear deal with Iran, the reintroduction of all the old pre-nuclear deal sanctions. There's been all this wrangling over these sanction waivers, all this rhetoric. However, most recently, you had this alleged threat from Iran or one of its proxies to U.S. interests or U.S. allies. It's really been extremely vague. However, John Bolton and other top people at the White House have been talking up this so-called threat from Iran. And of course, gave no detail whatsoever about what is supposed to happen or what they're supposed to do. Just, there's danger. And we're just supposed to take their word for that. Actually, an anonymous Pentagon official told the New York Times last week that he wasn't even aware of any immediate threat from Iran. He basically just said, I don't know what Bolton's talking about, but he said whatever it is, it must have emerged sometime in the last 28 to 48 hours. So I found that interesting because it kind of contradicted a previous report that had come out in Axios from an Israeli reporter who said that the Mossad had actually passed this intelligence about this Iranian threat, passed it along to Washington a couple weeks ago when a national security advisor in Israel met with his counterpart, John Bolton, and, passed along this intelligence. And so if the claim is based on this intelligence that was passed along weeks ago, then the threat wouldn't have just emerged a couple, within hours, like the DOD official told the New York Times. And so anyway, I don't know, maybe the Israelis were blowing smoke there and they didn't actually provide the claim, or maybe the anonymous official was lying to the New York Times. I don't know, but a lot of this whole thing I think is fishy. There's this vague accusation and it's hard to explain what the origin of it is. But regardless of the basis of the accusation, in response to this alleged threat, the U.S. started this huge military buildup right in the Persian Gulf and right on the Arabian Peninsula. So right in this, right in Iran's neighborhood. So we first moved this what's called a carrier strike group led by the USS Abraham Lincoln. We also have moved what's called an amphibious ready group headed by the USS Kearsarge and a bomber task force of B-52 bombers. And this has all happened in the last week. And so to just kind of break down what that means, what that entails, typically, a carrier strike group has with it 70 aircraft. It has a cruiser and at least 2 destroyers attached to it. So this is a small little grouping of warships. And then you also have the amphibious ready group, which has a sort of a ground troop component. So it has several thousand Marines on board. And then it also has a naval component with landing craft and assault ships and stuff. And this amphibious ready group also brought along a Patriot missile battery. And then we've sent at least 2 B-52H Stratofortresses, which are heavy long-range bombers, and those were sent to the Al Udeid base in Qatar. I think 2 more bombers were also sent somewhere in the region, but they didn't specify where they went. I don't think they went to Qatar. They might have went to Bahrain, where the 5th Fleet is headquartered, or even in the UAE, where we have an air base there called Al Dhafra.
I think they've carried out, bombings from long-range bombers out of Diego Garcia as well. And I believe that's under CENTCOM command, but I could be mistaken about that. So that's another possible location for those bombers.
Sure. Yeah. So it's somewhere in the region. But yeah, as you said, these are long-range bombers, and so they have quite the range. They can be stationed at a lot of different places and make it to their targets. And then also there's mid-air refueling, and there's all that stuff too. However, to add to this list, this arsenal that we've been moving into the Middle East, we also have we've sent over some F-35s, actually. I think they sent those to the UAE. And so altogether, this is quite a lot of stuff being moved into the region. Now, something I'll point out is that some of these deployments were actually scheduled quite a while ago. So it's not like all of this is just spontaneous and they're just moving it all in. They've just made that decision now. But regardless, though, the fact that the U.S. is trying to arrange some kind of pretext for a conflict around these deployments, it has really the same outcome as if they were spontaneously sent. And actually, part of me kind of wonders, if this whole thing was planned, the deployments and the ship and plane movements, but also to stage this big show and this threat along with it. I'm wondering if maybe this is sort of part of another maximum pressure campaign of the Trump administration, that they're trying to pressure the Iranians into negotiating or something.
Right. Well, maybe something we should take the time to really highlight here, because I think it's what makes our take on this story unique. You're not saying that you're concerned about this because the U.S. is deploying all these weapons to the Middle East, and that, a lot of these deployments are routine, but that the U.S. made a big deal out of it. And specifically, I think the John Bolton element in the Trump administration made a big deal out of it. And I think that's what's important to me, is that they seem to be really staking out that there's something that's going to happen here that, we need to put these forces in the Middle East for. I also think it's worth noting that when you're talking about actually, carrying out some kind of strike against Iran, I don't know if we deployed super effective weaponry. I mean, I see the Patriot missile batteries being helpful and useful, but the F-35 certainly isn't, a superior plane. And so far, all it's done is bomb some ISIS tunnels out in the middle of the Iraqi desert. And the carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf, I think, is more of a liability than an asset. And that certainly, reflects the public statements that Iran is making on the issue. We've played out these war games before, and it turns out the Iranian speedboats with, the big missiles attached to them can actually sink a U.S. aircraft carrier if it's out in the Gulf. And, we talked about having the long range bombers and everything like that. And I would think that unless, the U.S. is really doing, playing something ridiculous and stupid like a land invasion of Iran, the assets they're deploying to the Middle East are not extremely strategic to actually fighting Iran. I would think putting the, long range bombers in Qatar would, again, be more of a liability, because then it puts them in the range of Iranian missiles. Whereas if you put them somewhere far off coast, then I think they're relatively safe from attack from Iran. And the U.S., forces have plenty, strategically, and there's really no threat to them out in the middle of the sea from Iran. So with the range and everything like that, it's no problem to attack Iran.
Sure. I think you make a lot of good points. And I think a lot of that really is sort of my reasoning too for why I don't necessarily think that this is that they're not just signaling a full out invasion or something. That I think this might be more theater and more of a show, something designed to pressure the Iranians into doing something instead of actually designed to, be a real invasion or something. I think they would not broadcast it quite as much if they intended this to be a real confrontation. However, something I will point out though is simply the fact that as Javad Zarif himself, the Iranian foreign minister, said a month ago, that when you move all these assets into this region, you have the increased chance for accidents and something to just accidentally, for a war to spiral out of control from this, what they thought was going to just be this big, show maneuver. I think you really do increase the chances that a real conflict could spark from this, even if that wasn't the intention.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've certainly seen American ships, not in the Persian Gulf, but in other areas of the world, run into, either dry land or different kind of civilian ships. And so that's certainly something that could happen. Imagine if there's a ship carrying Iranian oil and the U.S., destroyers are trying to, stop it from passing. They collide, explosions happen, and suddenly everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else. And I mean, you can see how this thing really spirals out of control too quick. Or, well, maybe this is a good time to bring up one of your articles about the UAE and the damage to the ships at that port. You have something where a false flag is much more likely, where even if it's not the U.S. government that's going to, let's say, try to blow up an American ship in the Persian Gulf. I mean, hell, if you're like any kind of terrorist group that thinks that the fall of the Iranian Ayatollah would be a good thing, that, just pack up a speedboat full of explosives and go sail it at a U.S., ship. John Bolton will be more than happy to blame it on the Iranians without asking a second question. So I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, no doubt. I think like the chances for something like, regardless of what the intention is of the U.S. administration, I think that events aren't always fully under their control. And I think as this thing that happened at this UAE port kind of demonstrates that, like, the danger of escalating the tension to such a level that like any little thing might set off, a big escalation. So I don't know. Did you want to get into the UAE story now?
Yeah, talk about that a little bit.
Okay, sure. So in the context of this whole military buildup, like, I think you should definitely keep that in mind, and this amorphous threat from Iran that all these, American officials have been talking about. You now have this incident at a port in the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, at the port of Fujairah, where Saudi and Emirati officials are now saying that 4 commercial vessels had actually been sabotaged over the weekend on Sunday. They said this on Monday, but the sabotage is alleged to have happened on Sunday. And so this involved two Saudi tankers, they say, a Norwegian tanker and an Emirati ship. And I'm actually not sure what type of ship the Emirati one was. I read somewhere it was a barge. I read somewhere else it was another tanker. I'm not totally sure. However, one of our correspondents for RT Arabic, one of our Arabic language outlet, actually took some footage himself of some of these ships. And you can actually clearly see the damage to the Norwegian ship in this footage, although it's kind of harder to see the other ones. Like, you see the other ships, but you don't see the damage to them so much. However, in response to this, Norwegian Shipping Management Company, which is like responsible for the Norwegian ship that was involved, they came out and said an unknown object had caused the damage to the ship, but they didn't really elaborate further. However, when you look at the footage of the damage, it doesn't look like a big bomb or explosion happened to this ship. It kind of looks more like it ran into something, or something ran into it. It looks like a puncture of the vessel's hull. And I should note, none of these ships were like seriously damaged or sunk, and none of them leaked any oil or chemicals into the harbor. So otherwise, other than that footage showing the hole in the Norwegian ship, I'm not actually sure like what the extent of the damage was on these ships. The Emirati government denied that there were explosions at the port, which was reported in some media. I think Iranian, like Press TV actually reported there was fires and explosions at Fujairah. But the Emiratis, though, do agree that the ships were sabotaged. And then, of course, Saudi officials say basically the same thing. Now, Iran has, of course, they're not keen to have this blamed on them. And so they've come out and called for an investigation into this and said, like, we would like to know exactly what happened here. And you can kind of tell they're not wanting this to be blamed on them. And at first, nobody was actually pinning blame on anyone, which I found kind of odd. I almost thought, like, given all these threats and stuff and this idea of, like, there being this Iranian attack plan, I expected them to immediately come out and start blaming Iran. But they kind of waited for a second. However, they did actually. The U.S. military did come out today and say that, like, based on some initial assessment, they think it was Iran. Now, I should also note, too, that today you actually had additional incidents at a couple Saudi oil pumping stations where they say that the Yemeni Houthis, the rebels in Yemen, have also, attacked them with drones or something. And so if that's true, if indeed these oil pumping stations had been attacked by the Houthis, I definitely think that, it makes it very likely that the previous thing in the UAE also was probably the Houthis. And so that, to me right now, I think is the best explanation that we have here, is that this is probably something orchestrated by the Houthis. Although we don't actually have definitive proof of anything yet.
So one thing I find interesting, Will, is that you say only the Norwegian ship is the one that you could see show damage, and the other ones that wasn't the case. Especially because Bernard over at Moon of Alabama points out that in the past, U.S. submarines have actually run into ships and caused similar damage. And so if it turns out that only the one ship is damaged, well, that gives a little bit more weight to the case that it could have been a U.S. ship, especially if maybe there's an increased U.S. naval presence in the Persian Gulf here with, the carriers about to move in if they're, trying to make sure the waters are safer. I don't know how naval strategy works. I'll also add that it seems like there's no shortage of enemies here. I mean, you point to the Houthis, but certainly Hezbollah isn't any kind of allies with the UAE. The Qataris are still upset with the UAE. We know that government supports terrorist group. I had Brian Sadie on the show in the past, and he explained how the Emirates are, world renowned for smuggling and stuff like that. And gold smuggling and all these other kind of illicit transactions. And so if you had a situation where, somebody was either looking to do damage, to the reputation of the UAE government, or just because there's a lot of criminal elements at the end of the country. Yeah, so there's possible criminal elements in the UAE. There's, also the fact that I don't think the UAE isn't without its own political dissidents. I know that there's been princes of different families of the UAE that have come out against like the war in Yemen. And, just the fact that the war in Yemen is a genocide doesn't mean that, some crazy left-wing group doesn't hop in a boat and, it seems like an odd target, but at the same time, all these things are possible solutions. And from my understanding, the article I read this morning about the initial U.S. assessment, the only thing that they lay out is that Iran has the motive. And so, yeah, I guess Iran does, have a animosity with the UAE, and it's, kind of part of the Iran-Saudi split in the Middle East. At the same time, there are no shortage of people that, have motives here.
Right. Yeah. And right now, particularly, I would say Iran doesn't have a motive to, given all these threats, given all these accusations and stuff, I don't think they have quite a motive to bring this, suspicion upon themselves. You'd think they would wait for for things to cool down a bit before they wanted to sabotage a ship. Although I don't know, maybe it's meant to be a distraction from that.
No, I generally agree with that assessment because I think Iran is, attempting to, at the best it can, kind of negotiate what happens with the Iranian nuclear deal at this point. And the Europeans are key to this. If they could keep the Europeans in the deal and find some way to, start to bypass U.S. sanctions, whether it's, direct trade or something like that, I mean, that would be huge for Iran. And so it seems that, especially with one of these tankers being Norwegian, that being a really stupid target. But I guess it also doesn't mean that there's not rogue elements of the IRGC. That, actually, maybe these people are kind of, truther lunatics who, like the craziest of evangelical Christians who, want to bring upon the apocalypse, believe that they need to, provoke this war. I'm just saying, since there's no evidence right now, I just want to point out how absurd the claim is coming from the U.S. right now that this is, pinned on Iran. And as you point out, that I was absolutely shocked by this too, that nowhere in the statements from the Arab countries on this initially did anyone blame Iran. They weren't even well, maybe it's the Iranians. And I believe the U.S. has also, kind of vagued the term a little bit too, to say Iran are one of its actors. And so that way, if it's any group in the Middle East that's not, the state government of some country, they're going to blame it on Iran like they do every time.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of what led me to think that this was not some kind of staged pretext. That if it was a pretext, they would have used it as a pretext, and they kind of didn't. They did come out and kind of like you said, kind of vaguely say we think it might have been Iran, but they gave no evidence. They didn't even pretend to have evidence. However, in terms of plausible explanations of what this could be, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, that, leftists in the UAE. I know there's all kinds of crazy labor disputes and all kinds of really bad working conditions and stuff, and all these foreign immigrant workers in the UAE. One of my immediate thoughts is, is this some kind of labor thing? They're sabotaging the trade? However, we also need to remember here that this port of Fujairah and this area in nearby the Strait of Hormuz, this is one of the busiest maritime trading areas on planet Earth. And so there's a lot of stuff coming in and out of these places. So whether, something crashed into that Norwegian ship, I think it's hard to rule anything out at this point.
Right. Like I said, there's people who honestly believe global warming's going to end the world in 10 to 15 years. And so if they decide to start, crashing ships into oil tankers, you know what I mean? If you really believe that the world's going to end in 10 years, if you don't do something today about oil, then who knows what actions you take.
Right.
If you honestly believe you're defending yourself by doing something crazy like this. So I don't know. I think just, another thing worth talking about generally, if we're just, making things up, like the U.S. government does. So anyways, I think an important part of this, Will, is the position the U.S. take, and not necessarily what happened at the event, like the deployment of, more U.S. forces to the Middle East, but actually looking at, kind of what the U.S. government is saying. And so how much of this do you attribute to the Bolton factor? I mean, I certainly can't say Trump has been like, an Iran dove during the campaign. Like you could almost say he was like a Russia dove. But he certainly didn't seem this hawkish. And I don't think that candidate Trump would have said, yeah, I want to pick a war with Iran. Maybe the nuclear deal is bad. We need to renegotiate it, but I don't know. Do you have any take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think here is a case where it's a multifaceted thing. It's Trump does not have good instincts on Iran. He has bad instincts there. He's always associated the Iranians in the nuclear deal with Barack Obama, and just thinks that any getting along with Iran is something Obama did. So I have to oppose that and be against it. And that's played to his base very well. However, I don't think he's an extremely deep thinker on it. I don't think he's thinking about, moving carrier strike groups into the Persian Gulf and stuff. That is more of John Bolton territory. I think Trump has sort of left it to his advisors like Bolton to, come up with an Iran strategy, come up with something that's going to bring them back to the negotiation table. And we've sort of seen this model with Trump's maximum pressure campaigns that he's tried with the Koreans, for example, where they go out of their way to be way more hawkish and blustery than they really need to be, and try to pressure the other side to come to the negotiation table. This kind of looks like maybe something like that. I definitely have had, a hunch that this sort of is a show, that it is sort of meant to pressure the Iranians, as I was kind of saying earlier. But certainly in terms of who is driving it, I definitely think it would be, people like John Bolton and, maybe to a slightly lesser extent, Mike Pompeo. Definitely in terms of who's been publicly pushing these policies, it has been Bolton. Bolton is the one who gave the initial statement on this Iranian threat and, gave the statement on moving the carrier strike group into the Persian Gulf, saying that it's going to send a clear and unmistakable message to Iran. And so I definitely think this whole thing is John Bolton's baby here. This alleged Iranian threat and the movement of troops and planes and ships and stuff. Even if those were already scheduled, I think at least playing them up the way that we have been, that is Bolton's doing.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you said there, except I think Pompeo is quite a bit of a truther type on Iran. I think he has some religious fixations about the whole thing and the clash of cultures buy-in that he really scares me on Iran in particular. Unlike where I think he's probably still a hawk on Afghanistan and everything, but I don't think he thinks the Christians, the white Christians of the West, are fundamentally threatened by the Hindu Kush Mountains, like they apparently are Persia in his mind.
The Safavid Empire or something's going to come take over America. It's crazy.
Right, which of course is the enemy of the Iranian state, which is a completely different, kind of Muslim. But what does Mike Pompeo know? Going into the news from today here, Will, is we have. I saw this morning 120,000 potential troops being deployed to the Middle East, I guess, as a counter to Iran. I don't know. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I saw this too. This is reported in the New York Times. There was some questions about who it came from, because the NYT is not citing its source, not naming its source. But I was definitely kind of skeptical about this. I mean, it worried me. It was alarming when I first saw it. But given what I've seen up until now, it does not seem like they're planning on sending that many troops. Certainly I don't want them to, but it just seemed like that was, I don't know, there was something more going on behind the scenes, I think, with whoever decided to leak this information. It seems like it was maybe, and this is something that B at Moon of Alabama wrote about too, that maybe it was somebody leaking, for one reason or another. I think there's several plausible motivations you could kind of posit behind this, but they're trying to put forward the most extreme possible, retaliation to whatever Iran might do. And so I don't know. I think they're trying to sort of like butter us up for something, it seems.
Right. I was also, trying to piece together a little bit of what maybe they meant by this. 120,000 troops in the Middle East would be a lot, and certainly an increase of how many CENTCOM has deployed right now. But I don't know by how many, actually, when you start to add up the numbers of how many troops are in the Middle East, either on aircraft carriers or on the ground in, different deployments, especially if, you're kind of generous with it and start counting Afghanistan, all of Central Asia, Pakistan, maybe North Africa and the Horn of Africa or something like that. The general war on terror troops, probably numbers in the high tens of thousands now. So like I said, you would be deploying a lot more Americans to the Middle East if you did this, but it may not be as significant as it initially appears. There's also the issue that, as far as we could tell, I believe this is just one of the options presented, not necessarily the one that was definitely picked. And then, as Will said, we don't really know who leaked this information. And so, it could be quite different, and it would mean something very different, to me and Will, and I'm sure everybody out there, if this leak came from somebody in the Pompeo camp or Bolton camp versus if it came from somebody, maybe American firster in the Trump administration who, kind of believed in the whole no regime change wars deal, or maybe a Marine Corps general who read the report and said, well, I'm not sending thousands of my men to go die trying to invade Persia, and put this out there in hopes that it would kind of change the perception of the American people. So there's a lot of possibilities as to what this means. But the concerning thing is that we're even talking about this rather than withdrawing troops from the Middle East, which is what we should be doing.
Yeah, exactly. And something I'll note, too, is that Trump actually explicitly denied this report. He said, no, we're not sending 120,000 troops. So, whatever, take that for what it's worth. It doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to happen. But on this one, I tend to think that this was not something they ever planned to do for real. As B kind of wrote about at Moon of Alabama, the military will often present a number of options to the White House, like the, Goldilocks options, like, something that's too small, something that's just right, and something that's like way insanely overblown, responses to, they did this with I think it was the response to the Khan Sheikhoun attacks in Syria that Trump was presented with the same kind of like three options, the Goldilocks thing. And so this looks like somebody took the craziest option and leaked it to the New York Times. And as you're saying, yeah, there's several plausible reasons why this could happen. Like if you had more of a non-interventionist guy leaking it, then I could see the motivation being to sort of scandalize the public and to make them go, no, we can't send all these troops to the Middle East, and to provoke some kind of like resistance to it. But if it was leaked out of the Bolton Pompeo camp, then I could see it being trying to like soften people up to the idea. Sometimes they'll float trial balloons, and sometimes they'll even float trial balloons that are deliberately like exaggerated just to see the reaction, the potential reaction. So again, I'm not sure like what it is, what's behind this, but what I'm more certain about, though, or what I'm more confident about, is that we're probably not sending 120,000 troops anytime soon.
Well, and I think the most important thing to take from this story is that somebody, whether it's like a Tulsi Gabbard in the House or Rand Paul in the Senate, needs to introduce legislation that explicitly says that Congress has not given the Trump administration the authority to attack Iran, and until further notice, they cannot do so. You know what I mean? And maybe this is the kind of thing that they could use, because I can't imagine Congress could be okay with sending 120,000 troops to the Middle East without congressional approval.
I hope so. I would hope they wouldn't be okay with that.
I mean, of course, we'll talk about this right now then. They bombed Syria after Duma with absolutely no evidence that the attack actually happened and no congressional authorization whatsoever. That's right. I mean, Obama certainly didn't have a congressional authorization for his war against ISIS in that country. And then now we're attacking the enemies of ISIS in that country. Absolutely insane. But let's talk about Duma a little bit, Will. I'm going to go ahead and link to the episode on the show, the last one we did that we titled after Duma, because we do a really good job of going through and breaking everything down. But since then, we've had a couple developments. The first from Theodore Postal, who said that it's possible the Assad regime was dropping canisters and chlorine out of helicopters in order to push civilians to flee Duma. And he used some evidence taken from I think it was photos taken from a house where there's a whole bunch of dead bodies found and a puncture in the ceiling. And I guess it, was his conclusion that the canister halfway punctured the ceiling, leaked the chlorine gas out into the room. And then as people, fled from other maybe chlorine gas attacks or whatever up into the attic, because when there's a chlorine attack, you're supposed to go up, not down. They, hit the chlorine gas cloud and were immediately killed. Anyway, so that's that interpretation, but now we have some new stuff out from Moon of Alabama that he got from the OPCW report, so I'll let you break all that down.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, the Trump administration responded to this alleged chemical weapons attack in Syria by bombing. It was kind of a token strike. It didn't really do much. They claimed that they bombed chemical weapons facilities. That probably wasn't true, at least in some of the cases for some of the buildings. However, the OPCW did eventually send a fact-finding mission to Syria to figure out what happened. And the final report related to that investigation came out in March of this year. It was pretty inconclusive. It didn't land on a solid conclusion. However, it also didn't find great evidence that Assad used chlorine on the town, and that actually Theodore Postal had made a better case, I think, than the final report did, based on the stuff he was saying. In this final OPCW report, though, you did have a couple weird things in there. You had the group found this gas canister in what they called a rebel munitions factory, and the Syrian government asked them to check it out. And they found this canister, but then they didn't investigate it further. They didn't look into it or see what was inside of it, which seems like something, a pretty important thing to do. If you're investigating an alleged chemical weapons incident, you find a chemical canister and then you don't look into it. That's odd. However, the other weird thing that the OPCW found was this pair of other gas cylinders that were found inside two houses. And I believe they were separate houses. I could be mistaken about that. There's been a lot of confusion about what scene is which. Is the house they found the canisters in the same house they found all those dead bodies in? I've seen dispute about that. But I think it is the case, though, that at least one of the houses, they found a lot of dead bodies and a canister in. Nonetheless, the OPCW really had no explanation for why those cylinders looked like they had been moved and tampered with. They had photos of these cylinders that they initially obtained, and then by the time they got to the scene where these cylinders were supposed to be, they had been moved and tampered with, and one of them had been cleaned. And so somebody had been there and done something with these canisters. And so this is all in the final report. And it was kind of a weird, outstanding thing they never explained.
Yeah. And I'll add, I think the bodies at the scene were moved, and I believe they were moved from the upstairs area, which is what was shown in the initial video, to the basement of the house. And, I don't know, I thought that maybe added to the Postal case, just because I guess if you are trying to make it look better on video, then you would move it to the basement, because how do people die of chlorine in the attic or something like that? But it could also mean that the whole thing was just staged.
Right. Yeah, as you're saying, there are some outstanding things where it's not entirely clear what happened, or how to reconcile these pieces of evidence. However, the new thing that just came out, the OPCW didn't include in their final report this secret engineering assessment. And this was actually obtained by a group of academics and activists called the Working Group on Syria, Working Group on Syria, Propaganda, and Media. And I think that's who B was actually citing. But again, this was not put out with the final report. This conclusion in this engineering assessment was not publicized. And so it concludes, on the basis of OPCW engineers and their analysis and their study of this case, they concluded that it's more likely those gas cylinders were manually placed in both locations where they were found, instead of being dropped from a helicopter from above through the roof, as was sort of initially thought. And so this raises a question. It really, who put these canisters there and why? And also it throws some cold water on the idea that the Assad government dropped these from helicopters. And so I think this raises major questions about the narrative about Duma, what happened there, and who, if anyone, used chemical weapons on civilians there.
The reason all this is important, Will, is that this chemical weapons attack was used by the Trump administration to carry out airstrikes against the Assad regime, an enemy of ISIS in Syria, without congressional authorization, without a good factual evidence-based report on how that chemical weapons attack happened and directly who was responsible, trampling all over the Constitution. Of course, the U.S. media and the entire establishment buys in, and it's just such a terrible thing that happened. What now again seems like possibly a lie. I don't think anybody, would be able to conclude with, beyond a reasonable doubt that this, even chlorine attack happened, which is far different, than the alleged mass destruction kind of weapon like sarin, a neurotoxin that's odorless chemical, meant to kill on a mass scale, like we saw in Gauta in 2013, not like what we saw here, where a few people died in an attic, possibly of chlorine. So I don't know. Yeah. The whole thing's just real important, and it's unfortunate how all these things end up working out. But, Will, if you have anything else to add about this, Iran, or I don't know, any other thoughts or observations you have about the world before you wrap up, feel free to do so.
Oh, I guess I would just say that, like, as you and I have been talking about in private a bit, that you should keep your eye on the Persian Gulf. I'm not particularly like the most alarmist person about this. I'm leaning more toward that this is more of a show, but that it's creating dangers for accidental escalations. But nonetheless, yeah, I think your audience would be served to keep their eye on the Persian Gulf area and look at these American deployments and stuff and see what they're doing.
Right. Well, when you look at the leadership of, the region right now with Trump in the United States, seemingly led by Bolton and Pompeo, MBZ in the UAE, who's believed to be like a mentor of Mohammed bin Salman, MBS in Saudi Arabia, who has shown his, reckless attitude. Erdogan in Turkey, Bibi Netanyahu in Israel. Not that, you have the IRGC commanders and the Ayatollah who are very hawkish. At this point, when you look at the Middle East, you kind of think, well, at least you have Rouhani in Iran, who doesn't seem to be a complete nut on foreign policy, and have some kind of realistic idea of, what would happen and what a war between the U.S. and Iran would mean. And so when you do have these kind of escalations, even if it's only for show and it's just theater, and in honesty, it's not a big deal, and if all goes well and the U.S. ships are allowed to sail around without any kind of interference, they leave the Middle East in their 9-month rotation, and it means absolutely nothing. But at the same time, one of those ships is an Iranian ship or something, crazy happens when they're there, and, things turn into war very fast, and war with Iran is a really big deal. Yeah. So anyways, we'll tell people where they could find your work. That way they could keep up on what the U.S. empire is doing, and, be prepared to argue with people on, and tell them a little bit about what actually is going on in the world.
Yeah, sure. So, as you said earlier, Kyle, that my stories at RT don't often have bylines. I kind of just work with the web team, and we produce the news for the website for RT. But you can find my work shared at my Twitter page at WKP ANCAP, ANCAP. You can see all my articles there. Also, you can find me at the Libertarian Institute, Consortium News occasionally, antiwar.com occasionally. I have a huge archive at a place called the Daily Sheeple. I think that's about it.
All right. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks, Kyle.